the question, what is a woman, rests on a prior question, which is what is a human person. And I think what we see nowadays with things like the transgender issue is nobody knew how to answer the question, what is a human person anymore? And the way that that played out most acutely and most urgently was that we lost the ability to answer the question, what is a woman?
Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. My name is Piero Finaldi. I'm the CEO and publisher of the CTS and your host for this podcast. I'm very glad and honoured to be able to welcome Sr Carino Hodder here, author of a recent book for CTS, The Dignity of Women in the Modern World, and a Dominican with whom we have a great and growing partnership. And so, Sr Carino, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you based? And also, what's been kind of your story? Did you start off a kind of strong Catholic? Were you born in a medieval habit, or more or less?
Was I left in a Moses basket outside the convent as a baby, kind of thing? Yes. So, yes, my name's Sr Carino. I'm a Dominican sister of St Joseph. I believe you spoke to my prioress a few podcast episodes back. I've been a Dominican sister for 9 years. So I made my final profession, my final vows, 3 years ago. So I'm part of the furniture now in the convent. Our sisters, we're quite a small congregation. There's only 11 of us. And our service to the church, our apostolate, as we call it, is very much preaching the gospel, teaching the gospel, specifically through offering formation to adult Catholics. And again, in particular, those who are engaged in the ministry of catechesis. So we're very focused on equipping catechists to transmit faith more confidently and effectively. So like a lot of Catholics who are drawn to Christ as the truth and to the mission to evangelize and to spread the truth of the faith, I am a convert. So I wasn't brought up Catholic. I wasn't really brought up with any particular spirituality or faith background. I was received into the Catholic Church as a sort of a sacramental blank slate, as a spiritual blank slate, when I was 20. So I was baptized, confirmed, and received the Eucharist for the first time at the Brompton Oratory in London. So about 12 years ago now. And my journey from sort of nothing to the Catholic faith, again, I think it's fairly typical for a lot of people who take that particular path, in that when you grow up in a culture where in theory everything is up for grabs, and in theory this is meant to be very liberating, and in theory you can invent yourself from scratch, you actually, I did anyway, interpreted this and experienced this as a great burden, like as a great spiritual and psychological burden, and thinking, actually, I think the more natural and intuitive and freeing thing to believe is that there is an objective truth, and that, like, as I grow and mature and develop as a human person and as a woman, actually I'm being directed towards something objectively true. I'm not just making it up from scratch. And actually that's quite there's not much dignity and nobility in that idea. And I instinctively think of myself as having received my identity from somewhere. I wonder what different sort of beliefs, religious traditions out there kind of fit with that intuition that I've got. And I was deeply annoyed to discover that, the more I looked into the different faiths of the world, the Catholic faith kept sort of resonating in my heart and mind, which was really annoying because, there's this kind of cultural idea that Catholics are very, very rigid, are very narrow-minded, that actually you close off opportunities for free thought and for the exercise of conscience the more kind of Catholic you get. So to be constantly proved wrong about that, the more I looked into the Catholic faith, was very frustrating and annoying. And I think for me, the clincher, and again, I don't think I'm particularly unusual in this, was that when I discovered the Catholic community, so the idea that this is an actual community of real people worshipping and living together, and that's the place where all of the intellectual stuff makes sense. Not just my head in the abstract, but actually in this community of worship and living together. That's where this stuff makes sense. That helped a lot of things click into place. Like for a lot of people like my age, I did go through a stage of like the new atheism. Right. So So I was very into like Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens. Ayaan Hirsi Ali was a big one for me. She's actually since become a Christian, so I did it first, just saying. They were really big for me, and I felt like, maybe I found that real sense of purpose and of intellectual grandeur and coherence in the new atheists. And then I kind of tried to make that work for a bit, and it just wasn't hitting home for me. And actually, Ayaan Hirsi Ali was a big one for me. She identifies as a feminist, and she saw that her deconversion from fundamentalist Islam as a huge step in her discovering her dignity as a woman. And her big thing is, having a coherent atheist view of, or it was anyway, having a coherent atheist view of morality. And I read an essay of hers when I was a teenager where she talks about, we need to have a coherent atheist view of morality. And I'm going to present this to you in this essay. And I was like, brilliant, finally, I'm going to get what I want. And I'm paraphrasing slightly, but I got to the end of this essay, which I think is in a big anthology edited by Christopher Hitchens. And it gets to the end, and she just says, we can just invent our own morality. Mm-hmm. We can just invent our own. We can just create what feels right to us and live by that. And I just felt so let down, as a teenager searching for truth, reading that. And that really started to kind of, as in a sense, kind of like deconvert me from the new atheism. This sense of actually the dignity of the human person is found in the pursuit of an objective truth, and not in total self-creation and self-invention, which is actually a form of self-deception. I did philosophy and ethics A-level, which gave me like the broad view of everything that everyone has ever believed ever, but without huge amount of depth. Or maybe that's just how I chose to study it, I don't know. So I did A-levels, and then I left school and got a job. But I was an apprentice in a marketing and design firm, so I was on the front desk. So it was like person-centered, person-facing role. But the company was like in a town on the Isle of Wight and didn't have like a huge customer base. So I just spent a lot of time just like sat at the front desk, like waiting for someone to come in so I could use my customer service skills, which left a lot of time just for like reading and looking stuff up on the internet.
So this book, tell us a little bit about the origin.
Well, basically, I think when I first came into the faith, the church's teaching on the complementarity, what we call the complementarity with an E, between the sexes, sexual ethics, Christian anthropology, all of that was very striking because it was all very new. And actually, Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, who wrote a huge amount about the dignity of women, is my confirmation saint. So it was a big deal for me when I first came into the church. And then I think life just took me on a slightly different path in terms of my theological interests. And actually, when I was asked to give that talk at the Catholic Mothers Apostolate Conference that you talk about, I had kind of reached the stage in my spiritual life and my religious life where I was starting to think a bit more about what it means to be a woman, and specifically to be a consecrated woman. I think, whether you're married or whether you're a consecrated religious, you have to engage with that fundamental aspect of your identity as a woman, and as a consecrated religious, you have to engage with the bridal aspect of your consecration, whether or not you're kind of drawn very like naturally to that way of talking about yourself as a bride of Christ. You do have to engage with it at some point. And so for me, I kind of had the spiritual freedom to do that actually after I made final profession, whereas I know for a lot of people it's something that's a big deal for them earlier in their religious life. But for me, it like the bridal aspect and the idea of feminine dignity like really came up in a new way, like after I'd made final profession. And then Chiara, head of the Catholic Mothers Apostolate, asked me to give a talk at the Catholic Mothers Conference. And she said, what can you talk on? And I said, well, your conference is on, sort of women's vocations. I'll just do anything, just sign me up for anything. So she sent me through the program, and it was Sr Carino Hodder, Mulieris Dignitatum. I thought, oh dear, I've never read it cover to cover. I was like, better read it then. So Mulieris Dignitatum is an apostolic letter by Pope St John Paul II, written in 1988 for the Marian year, because there was a Marian year from 1987 to 1988. And so Chiara asked me to write a talk on it, and I thought, right, I better read it and just like do like a summary of the key points and that kind of thing. And obviously, because it's a magisterial document written by a saintly pope, you can't engage with it in that very kind of perfunctory way of I'm just going to like do a chat GPT on it and just like do like a summary. Yeah, exactly. It was really kind of weighing on my heart and mind. And at the same time, I'd recently come across the fact that Pope St John Paul II had been the Pope to unveil the new Sistine Chapel when it was renovated. So the Sistine Chapel, by the time we got to like the mid-20th century, was basically the frescoes in the Sistine Chapel and the artwork in the Sistine Chapel was absolutely just like covered in like soot, bird poo, damage, and also the fact that, you know, relatively soon after they'd been painted by Michelangelo, the big fresco at the back, the Last Judgment, there'd been quite a bit of censorship done, a lot of extra clothes added to the bodies, and in retrospect, people have thought, well, maybe this is actually quite an excessive amount of censorship on the glorified bodies of the saintly humans at the Last Judgment. You know, maybe this is a bit much. So there'd been a lot of restoration work done on the Sistine Chapel, and JP2 had unveiled those renovated frescoes. And he'd used the phrase that the Sistine Chapel is like a sanctuary of the theology of the body. And this work of restoration had a spiritual meaning, because it was restoring and unveiling the dignity of the human person. And it kind of struck me that that's kind of what he does in his theology, Pope St John Paul II. And I thought, well, he would have been writing Mulieris Dignitatem at around the time that the Sistine Chapel was being renovated, so that these beautiful images of the human person that we see, especially in Michelangelo's Last Judgment, we can actually see them for what they truly are in all their beauty and their glory. And that's kind of what he's doing in Mulieris Dignitatem. So all of this was kind of churning in my mind.
Because it wasn't just a restoration in terms of cleaning, was it? Because there were all these bits of cloth and sort of, you know, judiciously placed bits of cloth over kind of naked bodies.
Exactly.
Those were sort of, a lot of those were removed as well.
They were. And actually, even more than just the painting on top of Michelangelo's original fresco of the Last Judgment, the artist who had been tasked with the censorship, who has gained the nickname the Breeches Maker in art history, he actually scraped off the original paint so that he could plaster over and paint something more to the tastes of the time in terms of modesty. And, you know, just there's the image of somebody looking at a Michelangelo fresco and thinking, gosh, this is a bit much, I better scrape this off, and actually accruing something non-essential on top, like sticking something non-essential on top. That's a very striking image, and it fits in quite well to an understanding of what Pope St John Paul II is doing when he develops the Church's doctrine on the dignity of the human person and the dignity of women, because he's also removing the extraneous stuff that's been stuck on top that maybe we think is authentic Catholic teaching, but is actually something quite culturally conditioned, and actually removing that to reveal what was left underneath, or restoring what was underneath.
And this
is authentic.
Is already inspired by something that Christ himself said, no? When he was talking about divorce, and he said, but in the beginning it was not so.
Yes.
So already there he was saying, no, we need to get back to how things were originally. I mean, it's interesting that this document, you know, comes out in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we're sort of almost 40 years after the document, and we have some really kind of rather kind of extreme. I mean, some of the ideas even that he was kind of grappling with already have been taken to some really sort of extreme levels now. So, I mean, how did you find reading it with the background of, you know, transgenderism, self-authorship, you know, these very you know, even very, you know, recently, the ideas like, you know, abortion up to birth and all these things which have sort of come after that. How did you find it kind of stood up to the kind of almost, you know, breaking point testing that these ideas about femininity have had in the recent past?
Well, all papal teaching has a prophetic character, because it's an exercise of the teaching office of Christ, which grows out of the prophetic character of our baptism, but the prophetic nature of JP2's words in Mulieris Dignitatem, the way that he speaks God's truth into a specific situation in history, I think is particularly clear with Mulieris Dignitatem, because so much of what he says and what he points out in this letter, you know, in the late 80s, has just become more and more apparent when we look at certain trends in modern culture, which I think some of them are actually coming to an end. They're petering out. I think like the height of transgenderism, I think, has been and gone. That reached its peak, its fervour, and is starting to decline. But
please God.
Hopefully. The Supreme Court said a couple of months ago that for the purposes of the Equality Act, sex refers to biological sex. And that this is simply how the law is to be interpreted. So, and that there are two biological sexes for the human species, a male and female. So I think the
so it's interesting that you had to specify that.
Just to be clear.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to like a YouTube short from this, just want to be clear what we're saying here. So much of what he says is a practical tool for making sense of what is happening today. And I think one of the most important things that JP2, I'm just going to call him JP2, save on words, JP2 does in Mulieris Dignitatem is he points out that the question, what is a woman, rests on a prior question, which is what is a human person. And I think what we see nowadays with things like the transgender issue is nobody knew how to answer the question, what is a human person anymore? And the way that played out most acutely and most urgently was that we lost the ability to answer the question, what is a woman? And again, this is something that JP2 predicts. He says when we have these crises of meaning, these crises in society of what is a human person, how are we meant to live together, the people who bear the brunt of those crises are women. And so in the transgender issue, what you see is the places where it really reached a crunch point and where the debate became very fiery, and the place where the pitfalls and the dangers of allowing people to self-define their sex became really, really obvious was women's sports, women's changing rooms, women's prisons, women's public toilets, the places where women require particular safeguards for particular vulnerabilities. That was where this stuff played out. And all of this is predicted and made sense of by Pope St. John Paul II in Mulieris Dignitatem. Another point on that actually as well, when nowadays we try to make sense of women and like what role are women meant to play in society, in culture, I think what we see in the modern world is we see two temptations, either to say that this particular era in history has the best idea of what women's vocation and women's dignity should look like, or we say this particular sort of culture has the best idea. Or actually, or we say that the extent to which you can be like a man is the guarantor of your dignity as a woman. The extent to which you can play act as a man and to play down what makes you distinctly female, that's the guarantor of your dignity. And what JP2 says is actually this isn't historically conditioned, this isn't culturally conditioned, and also it can't play into what he calls male patterns of domination, or like male sort of normativity, of like human beings are normatively male, and then you've got these ones on the side who are a bit smaller and weaker and sort of clean-shaven, and we call those women. So he says that's not the way to understand women's dignity. We actually go back to the basic principles of our creation in the image and likeness of God, and our creation as relational beings. And that's where we start to make sense of women's dignity.
So, I mean, one of the sort of strange things that's happened recently as a kind of backlash to the kind of things that we've been talking about is that you've ended up with these almost sort of caricatures of. So, yes, you've got the idea that, the best type of woman is the one who's most like a man. Okay, now if we can leave that aside maybe and come back to that. But then there's the other side, which is, okay, what's what a woman is expressing her full femininity, and you end up with either the sort of the kind of trad wife movement or the sort of girl boss movement. I mean, what do you think that sort of, how did you approach that in the book, and how did JP2 sort of approach that?
Yeah. So actually in the last chapter of the book, which is called The Woman of Today, I set out these two kind of like paradigms of like female fulfillment of you've got this idea, this sort of subculture of the girl boss, which is essentially conforming to male ideas of success. And also then you've got the trad wife, which is basically saying things are terrible now, but maybe if we try to go back to a culture of female fulfillment that's more like what we would have lived maybe in the 1950s, we'll find something good there. So moving towards men or backwards in history. And I think JP2's answer to that is to actually go to the very nature of what a woman is, who the female human person is, and also what the scripture and the tradition of the church reveals, because the scriptures and the tradition of the church give us timeless truths, which are to be interpreted in a particular stage of human history. That's why we have the magisterium of the church. But they're above human history and above culture. They're not conditioned by them, and they enter in to human history through the ministry of the church. And JP2's big thing about female dignity is that firstly, it arises from the relational nature of the human person. So we're called to be in a complementary relationship with men, not one of conflict. And maybe we can be complementary to each other as well, I don't know, both at the same time. And then also that we're called to basically look to what the church is, because women's dignity to a great extent is found as an image of the nature of the church itself, and the church is a virgin, a bride and a mother. And that doesn't mean that all women must be, sort of literally sacramentally married, literally like virginally intact physically, and literally biological mothers, because obviously you can't be all three of those at once. But what JP2 says is that women's dignity is found, as I say, firstly acknowledging that relationality with men, and saying that when we look to the church as virgin, bride and mother, that gives us like the template for the attitudes, like the spiritual attitudes that all women can have. And so he talks about motherhood as that receptivity, that readiness to receive the human person and to nourish and sustain their life as a human person. So not being concerned about their worth in society, their abilities or lack of abilities, but actually being ready to welcome the gift of the human person and to nourish their life physically and spiritually. With virginity, this is that attitude of like wholehearted acceptance of the truth of faith and the truth of who we are. Because the church talks about virginity or the virginal attitude as applying to the virtue of faith before it talks about it as applying to bodies. It's like some women are called to live out that kind of consecrated virginity, like in a physical way, but all women have that virginal attitude of accepting the faith wholeheartedly. And then brideship is about that call to union that we have, that call to be in a communion of persons with others and to find ourselves through that communion. So these kind of three attitudes, they're lived out differently in each woman's life, because you might be, sacramentally married to a man, you might be a consecrated religious, or you might be a single person in the world, neither consecrated nor sacramentally married, or waiting to see what God wants for you, what's next for you. But these attitudes of virgin, bride and mother, these spiritual attitudes, which have different kind of physical manifestations in different walks of life. This is the template, the vision for women's dignity and vocations, not anything that male modes of being give to us, not anything that the culture in itself give to us, not anything that human history viewed outside of salvation history gives to us.
I mean, I can almost sort of feel the sort of 21st century, Western person sort of hair sort of
falling over and screaming.
Yeah, and just sort of thinking, gosh, so this is a document written by an old white man, celibate, who he's talking about women. He's using these unbelievably kind of old-fashioned
loaded terms,
virgin, spouse, all things which our sort of Western kind of mindset has completely rejected. In a sense, why should anybody listen to it? Why should anybody listen? I mean, he was already in his sort of 70s, probably.
I think that,
John Paul II.
Exactly. Yeah. I think one of the things that will make us more receptive to JP2's teaching is seeing how it's now being echoed, whether knowingly or unknowingly, I think unknowingly, by modern secular feminists. So much of what JP2 says about marriage, about childbearing, about the distinctiveness of female bodies and the distinctiveness of women's role in society and the complementarity between men and women. So much of what he says is now being echoed by modern day feminists, what are sometimes called sex realist feminists. So people like Mary Harrington, Louise Perry, Helen Joyce. This is being echoed. Why? Where does this come from? Well, it shows us that actually so much of what JP2 says is rooted in our natural ability to understand the world around us, to understand natural law. Because so much of this starts with an anthropology that isn't scared of the truths of our physically embodied nature. Now, he's able to take it to its conclusion because he's got that spiritual horizon. He knows how all of this is completed and fulfilled in Christ. But so much of what he says is actually accessible on the level of natural reason, which is why it's now being picked up by feminists who are looking at the rubble and detritus left by the sexual revolution and saying, maybe we should go back and rethink some of our basic principles here.
And it's interesting that like Mary Harrington, for example, she starts kind of drawing these conclusions once she's experienced motherhood. Basically.
Yeah.
And sort of suddenly saying, oh, well, we're definitely not all the same, and we're definitely, we definitely are sort of pointed in a certain direction by our very nature. I mean, it might be worth, tell me if this is a sort of red herring or whatever, but it might be worth sort of saying something about John Paul II's philosophical background also, and I mean, you mentioned Edith Stein as well in the sort of phenomenological philosophy, which looks very carefully at the things that are happening to us, the phenomena that we experience. I mean, do you think that's because it seems to me that is like a sort of meeting point with these sort of sex realist feminists as well.
Yeah, I think so. That as you said, that phenomenological background, and I think also so much of Pope St John Paul II's teaching on the dignity of the human person kind of takes its guiding light from the Second Vatican Council's statement in Gaudium et Spes in paragraph 22, where it says it's only in the mystery of the incarnate word that the mystery of man takes on light. So looking to the human person, trying to understand their nature, paying proper attention to human experience and the value and nobility of our human experience in the world, but looking at it with that light of Christ. That really characterizes JP2's sort of anthropology. I think another important thing to point out about Pope St John Paul II, apart from his sort of academic background, is the fact that I think so much of his theology, of his just intuitive understanding of sexual complementarity, comes from the fact that he actually just empirically, physically spent a lot of time around both men and women. And he had female friends. He knew a lot of young married couples when he was Archbishop of Krakow. There's a really wonderful Catholic philosopher called Sister Prudence Allen, who's done a huge amount of work. She's just the absolute sort of go-to philosopher on the history of male-female, the historical understanding of male-female relations and of like the philosophy of women. Throughout Western history. Sister Prudence Allen, she says that the thinkers who have the most coherent Catholic view of sexual complementarity are the ones who actually spent in their personal lives or in their working lives the most time with the opposite sex. So she also points out St. Hildegard of Bingen, the doctor of the church. She's another great example of a Catholic thinker who had a very robust idea of male-female complementarity. And it's because she spent so much time with men, working with men, as well as with women and working with women. And with JP2, it's kind of the same, that, he knew women and he knew married couples so well that, combined with that sort of phenomenological approach to theology, where human experience has a huge amount of significance viewed in the light of Christ, all of this came together quite nicely.
Yeah, I mean,
like a large hadron collider of theology. Like,
well, my own experience of that, for example, was trying to read Love and Responsibility before I was married.
Okay.
And finding it completely opaque and not understanding it at all. And then I remember, being on a holiday in Sicily where it was raining for a week, weirdly, and ended up trying to reread Love and Responsibility after I'd been married a couple of years, I think. And all of a sudden, it all made sense. Because it was so based on these discussions and experiences that he'd shared with these groups of kind of married couples that he was following. So it was very, very much anchored in the experience and not in a sort of rationalist kind of idea of what men and women are like, rather than what they're actually like. I suppose I mean, John Paul II, and I think the church throughout the church's history has always held up Our Lady as the example of everything that is greatest in not only in humanity but specifically in womanhood, and yet she's always been a really, really kind of problematic figure, especially for feminism, because she embodies these roles which are very unfashionable.
Again, the loaded words.
Yeah, so say
virgin, mother, bride. Yeah. And what's really interesting is that in Mulieris Dignitatem, JP2 starts off by giving this broad view. He says, dignity of women, big topic of theological importance. Put it in the context of the dignity of the human person, the role of the laity, like all these big picture things. And then he moves on to talk in the next chapter just about Our Lady. And it's like, well, you've gone from the whole of humanity now down to just this one woman. What's that about? And he very much puts it in the context of what he calls in Mulieris Dignitatem and also later documents he's written, like his letter to women in 1995, the feminine genius. And what he says about Our Lady is that firstly, she shows that our relationship with God is the ground. It's like the seedbed in which our human dignity fully flourishes. So the thing about Our Lady is that she, as a free, rational human person, is totally open and receptive to God's will in a way that does not crush or diminish her human dignity, but that openness to God's will allows her to live out the fullness of these attitudes of the female vocation that JP2 talks about, of being a virgin with that wholehearted attitude, that wholehearted acceptance of the faith from the virginity, and then from the motherhood, that readiness, that openness to protect and nurture new life, and the brideship of her union with God. And he puts all of this in the context. I don't know how much he's deliberately poking Simone de Beauvoir in the eyes with this, but he deliberately puts all of this in the context of female readiness. So he avoids words like passivity, and he does use passivity and receptivity in these concepts to an extent, but Mary is freely, actively ready to receive God's will and to put it into practice through that openness to God's will in the specific situation in which she finds herself in human history, and to do so in a way that's focused not on social structures, on the institutions, anything like this, but on the dignity of the human person, the human persons that she's put into contact with. And so for JP2, that's the fundamental, that's the fundamentals of feminine human dignity. It's that you live out your relationship with God, in whose image and likeness you are made, to its fullest, in a way that has this very distinctly feminine, active, free, rational readiness to receive the will of God and to put it into practice in a way that's totally focused on the dignity of other human persons and not on any other kind of considerations.
I mean, let me sort of play devil's advocate and sort of push yes. a bit on this, because it seems, to use Our Lady as the sort of exemplar for this, it just seems like she's such an atypical kind of person. She's conceived without sin. She has a child but is a virgin. she's the mother of God, and yet the church then says, okay, now that's the archetype. This unbelievably unique person is the one that you're supposed to be is the archetypal one. Yeah. Why does the church do this?
I think the thing to bear in mind is that Mary isn't just held up to us as an exemplar over there, like up in heaven over there, but also she's also given to us as actually our help on every stage of the journey, because she is our mother in the church. She is the mother of the church, and therefore all of our mothers as the baptized. And what JP2 does in Mulieris Dignitatem is kind of takes us like beneath the bonnet, beneath the surface of everything that's very kind of distinct about Our Lady, down to those basic principles of actually wherever we are in our lives, whatever kind of social situation we're in, we can live out those attitudes that Mary has in their fullness. We can strive to live out these attitudes with her help, which means with the help of the ministry of the church. And something that JP2 says about Our Lady, which I think is really beautiful, is when he talks about the Magnificat, so her canticle of praise, where she goes to her kinswoman Elizabeth, and just proclaims that, my soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Saviour. JP2 says that this is a sign, the Magnificat, it's a sign that in living out the will of God, Mary's not just discovering the nature of God. She's not just discovering the plan of salvation for the whole of humanity. She's also discovering, in a deeper way, her own feminine humanity. And that's the phrase he uses, discovering her own feminine humanity. And that's also the case for all of us, in that we're not meant to just sit statically where we are, look over at Mary over there and think, wowzers, that's a bit much. But actually we're called to each day give that little yes in whatever situation we're in, with the grace that God gives us through the church, which is our mother, and Mary is the image, the type of the church. And in giving our little Magnificats every day, we grow not only in knowledge of God and his plan for us, but also in knowledge of our own feminine humanity in the way that Mary did. Because I bet, with that great humility that she had, and the fact that she Our Lady is fully human, so she does experience the full range of human passions in her life on earth. That sense of smallness and that sense of growing over the course of our lives, that is something that Our Lady would have experienced as well. That sense of growing in a deeper understanding of ourselves and what God is calling us to. That's also part of Our Lady's story as well, that we can emulate and learn from.
I mean, the other word that's in the title of JP2's text, this question of dignity, I think is quite an interesting word, and I think something that maybe almost people would kind of push back against and sort of say, well, why do we have to talk about the dignity of woman? Is it because it's been taken away from her by the patriarchy, or
what about men?
What are we talking? Do all lives matter, even men's lives matter? But it's not so much that. It's just why do we have to talk particularly about the dignity of women? Is it just a reaction against what's happened to women in the past, or is it something else?
I think it's a mixture of several things. And JP2 does say at the beginning that he's putting this question of the dignity of women in the context of the church's developing teaching and developing focus on the dignity of the human person in general. So with like Gaudium et Spes in the Second Vatican Council, where you have this beautiful teaching on the dignity of all human persons, but which does mention the fact that men and women within the human family are sexually differentiated. And what does this mean for our lives together? And also there was a synod of bishops in 1988 on the role of the laity. And one of the things that came out of that synod of bishops was, well, to understand the dignity of all lay people better, the dignity of the baptismal call to holiness, we need to understand a bit more this thing of sexual differentiation in a theological way. So there was this call of like, okay, if we talk about the dignity of the human person, right, we're Catholic, so we're not scared of the physical and the material and the natural. So we need to acknowledge that within that dignity, we've been created as a sexually dimorphic species. Right. You know, we have male and female. What's that about? What does that mean? So it comes within the general call of understanding better the dignity of the human person and acknowledging that that dignity is lived out in a sexually dimorphic way. But at the same time, again, because we're Catholics, we're not afraid of history, and we're not afraid of culture. And so we can acknowledge the fact that within human history, marked as it is by original sin, the structures of sin within different human societies and human cultures do seem to have impacted women in specific ways, right? And there's no harm in acknowledging that. So when JP2 talks about the dignity of the human person, he then can also say, but we need to pay particular attention to the dignity of women because that has been historically denigrated more than the dignity of men. So let's just clear up some stuff first, you know? Let's scrape off those loincloths first. Let's clear up that bird poo first from our metaphorical Sistine Chapel. And I do think actually the church has more work to do in the future on developing its theology of the masculine genius as well as the feminine genius. And, you know, JP2 does start that, you know, in his magisterial writings on St. Joseph. And I think that's been continued by Pope Francis, in his writings on St. Joseph. But I think there is a bit more work to be done there. But I think it's okay that we started with women first, because historically there's been more of a denigration of women's dignity. And also because the culture, sort of the vibe in the church was we're developing our understanding of what the church is and what the baptismal vocation is. And there is a particular affinity between the language that we use to describe the identity of the church and the language we use to describe the identity of women, you know, the church's virgin bride and mother. And so when we're talking about the lay vocation, there is this very significant, theologically significant overlap between the concepts we use to talk about the church as a whole and the female vocation. So it does also make theological sense if we're thinking more deeply about the church, about the baptismal call to holiness, about the lay vocation, to also then think specifically about women's dignity as well. So I think there's lots of converging reasons why it makes sense to start with women first, but we don't then need to say, well, we're ignoring the other 50% of the dignified human person.
And I mean, you know, the problem I think can be that the church ends up looking either kind of defensive, because, you know, we're often attacked on the fact that, well, there's, you know, an all-male priesthood, and, you know, the positions of power in the church are all in the hands of men, and so, you know, is the church just doing this to kind of as a kind of sop to feminism, or is it something deeper than that?
I think it's worth pointing out that the same Pope who wrote so extensively about the dignity of women is the same Pope who infallibly defined that the church does not have the authority to ordain women to holy orders. So there's no kind of contradiction here. And I think it's also... Well,
I mean, presumably there's those looking in
to the
from
outside,
it looks like there's a huge contradiction there.
It looks like. And I think that's why it's important that all of JP2's arguments about female dignity are actually rooted in the sources of our faith, in scripture and in tradition, in, above all, kind of the witness to our beginnings that we get in the creation narrative in Genesis, and like the actual metaphysical meaning of the creation account in Genesis, of the witness also of St. Paul in Ephesians 5, in the witness of different saints, both male and female. He's rooting all of this actually in the modes through which divine revelation comes to us, the scriptures and the tradition. And he does acknowledge that there are things going on in the world more broadly, women taking more of a role in society, but he's very clear that this has been a catalyst in a way for the church, but it hasn't been the driving force or the underlying sort of fundamental reason why. The church has always had an understanding of female dignity as part of its understanding of human dignity in general. And now, he says, in the 80s, and also still is the case, now is the time to reiterate that. In terms of power, and in terms of what we'd call like sacred power, like the power that comes with holy orders. I've always been really fascinated about the fact that when you say the sacrament of holy orders is reserved to men, I think for me, the obvious conclusion from that is that, well, in that case, holy orders clearly isn't intrinsically linked to sanctity or to the exercise of power and authority more broadly in the church. Clearly, sacred power isn't the only form of power and authority in the church. Yeah. And yet so many people actually take it the other way to mean, well, if women can't be in holy orders, that must say something, not about holy orders, but about women themselves. And I think this, as far as I can see, this is a symptom of a church in which we haven't actually paid enough attention to the dignity of the baptismal vocation and to the lay vocation. Because the church is very clear that actually women image and manifest the lay vocation, the baptismal vocation in general, in a more kind of profound and significant way than men generally do, because of that nature of being virgin bride and mother.
What do you mean by that? Okay,
yeah. The virginity, the bridehood, and the motherhood. What is kind of intrinsic to the embodied nature of a female human person lends itself far more easily and obviously to the language that we use to talk about the church. And actually, this is something that Cardinal Ratzinger, talks about in a document, 2004 document called The Collaboration Between Men and Women in the Life of the Church. He talks about this in a very, very profound but also very precise way. As the chap who was head of the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith under JP2 and also shared, I think, a lot of his theological vision of the dignity of women. And if we view it in that way, then the idea of admitting women to holy orders doesn't augment or increase women's dignity. It dilutes it, because suddenly you're mixing the messages. How can women both be the most kind of profound and more obvious manifestation of the church's vocation and also conformed to Christ the head? You're mixing and diluting something that actually is very strong, very profound, and very coherent in itself. And I do wonder, if we had a more profound sense of the dignity of women's vocations as virgin bride and mother, would we ask the question, why can't women be priests? And I do wonder if instead we would ask the question, why can't men be mothers? That seems really unfair, given the significance of motherhood, biological and spiritual motherhood, in the Catholic faith. I mean, both of these questions, I think, are ultimately the wrong question to ask. Why can't women be priests? Why can't men be mothers? But to me, if you're gonna sense an injustice within the fullness and the beauty of the Catholic faith, I would say that the perceived injustice would be more obviously that men can't be mothers. Ultimately, there is no injustice here. It's all fine. But that's kind of how I see it.
I think a question that was confronted in The Life of Brian, I think, wasn't it? Why can't men be mothers?
That great theological text.
Yes, indeed.
Is it? I'd forgotten that bit.
Yes, there's a great little bit about
really?
about that. Have a look at it on YouTube.
I remember the bit I remember most from Life of Brian is the bit where you've got those women at the stoning with the beards on,
right.
And a guy goes, "Are there any women here?" And they go, "No."
Well, I think we should definitely leave that bit in. The thing that I thought was, because in a sense the difficulty that we have when we confront these questions is that they're taking place in a kind of background or against the background which has kind of really distorted the whole question. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I know that John Paul II uses the word feminism, I think, it's a new feminism.
He does, yes, once in his magisterial teaching. Yes.
And people, that's becoming kind of a bit controversial. So what would you say about, I suppose, partly, I'd like to know what you think about feminism, and what you think of the way that John Paul II referred to it.
So,
is it a useful word?
Is it a useful word? Well, luckily, JP2 in a way leaves it up to us. He invites us to develop a new feminism, but
so he obviously doesn't like the one that's there.
No. He invites women to develop a new feminism. What he says in Evangelium Vitae, paragraph 99, for those of you following along at home, he says that it falls to women to develop a new feminism that, and this is the crucial bit, that rejects male models of domination. So he says that too often previous models of feminism have basically bought into a male paradigm of basically the way to ensure women's dignity is to try to erase or forget physical differences, and especially the physical differences that become very manifest in, say, motherhood, or when we think about our female fertility. So he says, reject those male models of domination, actually develop, he invites us, he says it falls to women to develop a new feminism that rejects those male models of domination and is actually rooted in what he calls the feminine genius. So that what is distinct about women, not ignoring our physical nature, and being aware that physical nature reveals a capacity for maternity that actually exists on a higher spiritual level, of it's that readiness to welcome the human person and to be attentive to them in themselves. So he says, develop a new feminism, it's up to you. He doesn't say you have to, he kind of says you can. And I know some Catholic women are very hesitant about this because feminism is one of those words that seems to have been like toxified beyond redemption. And the phrase that Sister Prudence Allen, who I mentioned earlier, uses is she uses the phrase ransom, like ransom the term feminism, win it back. And she uses that about gender as well. So the option is there. The Pope has said it falls to women to develop a new feminism. And there's been lots of interesting response to that. So like when I think of sort of like modern day Catholic feminists, you've got people like Erica Bacchiocci, Abigail Favale, Leah Libresco-Sargent, who are doing great work on developing that new feminism. But I think none of them would say that Catholic women have to identify as feminists. And I think one of the things that's come out of the thinking in Catholic feminism is that...
But would they also say that Catholic women can't identify as feminists?
I don't think so, no. Because I think that especially Abigail Favale points out, she's amazing, again, a convert, like all amazing people. That's a joke. I love cradle Catholics too. Abigail Favale, who came through kind of secular feminism, she says that one of the things that is quite distinctive about feminism is it's a parasitic ideology in that, not parasitic, but that sounds pejorative, but it needs a deeper ideology to be attached to. So
it's a Marxist feminism, or
there needs to be feminism is like a particular way of looking at the world through the prism of your deeper ideology, your deeper ideological commitments. So you can't. I think she would advise that don't just say feminist, some kind of feminist, like Marxist feminist, Catholic feminist, and that does mean that types of feminism are going to look very different. So I think they would counsel just being careful how you use the word feminist to make it clear what you mean by feminism. And I think the trend, or one of the trends that's kind of emerging within Catholic feminism, is to see Catholic feminism not as a development of like first wave, second wave, third wave feminism, fourth wave feminism, and then you've got Catholic feminism, but to see it more as a development out of the Church's teaching on the dignity of the human person, which is clearly rooted in the Church's actual teaching.
Which is what John Paul II was sort of saying. It's
exactly.
Like we can't. So this question, which has become the great kind of gotcha question for all politicians, etc. What is a woman?
Yeah.
The real answer. Well, what is a human being?
Exactly. Yes. And if you can answer that question, you can answer the question, what is a woman? And as to what kind of feminist you are, that very much depends on what kind of pro-human person you are. And so, yes, I think a lot of Catholic feminists would say, well, as long as we're rooting this in the idea that human beings share an equal dignity, but we can talk about female dignity in a specific way because we are a sexually dimorphic species, and that actually has a theological significance in the plan of salvation. And also, women's dignity has historically been denigrated in a way that men's not necessarily always has. So you build it out of Catholic theology rather than saying, well, I looked at fourth wave feminism and I added some of my Catholicism on top to make it more kind of Catholic-y.
I mean, it's interesting where, sort of to go back to Mary Harrington again, she talks about, she talks about contraception in particular as like a sort of first
transhumanist technology.
And how feminism, seen through these kind of male power dynamics, ends up becoming a kind of transhumanist project, i.e. you have to go and you have to fix all these kind of weird things that women do, like having babies and periods and this, that, and all these things which kind of stop them from being exactly like men. But you have to go in and through a technocratic paradigm, basically kind of fix all that.
Yeah. This is very much what JP2 is talking about when he talks about a feminism that rejects male models of domination. And I would say, one of the nice things about living in, the year of our Lord 2025 is that there's so much like happy collaboration between secular feminists and Catholic feminists because, yes, so much of what's going on in the aftermath of the secular revolution just works on the assumption that stuff that women naturally do is a burden or like adjacent to some kind of pathology.
Yeah.
So like if you see male fertility as like the paradigm, then female fertility is a massive problem, Whereas actually if you take that sexual complementarity view of that, the male and female way of being embodied in the world is distinct but equal, then female fertility isn't a problem. It's just something that's part of life to be accommodated in sensible ways. And this is
more than
model
accommodated. It's kind of celebrated.
Yes,
in a sense, sort of going back. That was, we had a healthier kind of view of that. The not only the dignity but almost the kind of the honor that was given to mothers.
Yeah.
I think something we've talked about a bit on other podcasts as well. But I mean, I think you were there that evening where Mary Harrington was speaking in Ogle Street, and it was just amazing watching this basically kind of Marxist feminist come to all the Catholic conclusions just through her
natural
own
reason.
Yeah,
natural reason. Yeah, because so much of the Catholic Church's teaching on the dignity of women, on our understanding of maternity, our understanding of fertility, our understanding that contraception is something that's not in keeping with the dignity of the human person. So much of this is actually based in natural reason. And it comes to its fulfillment and its fullness through divine revelation. But we have this incredible kind of like middle of the Venn diagram overlap with so many people, so many women who just look at the world they live in and think, this is not actually helping my happiness. This is not helping my fulfillment. I wonder why. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's why.
I mean, not to be too kind of Pollyanna about this and sort of say, oh yeah, we're all going to the sort of sunlit uplands where, the feminists and the Catholics will unite and
skip together,
we'll all have
hand in hand through the fields.
12 children and live in a wonderful world. Because, we've just had this horrific week in UK politics where, abortion has been decriminalised up to birth. I mean, why? In a sense, the question is, why are those two? Why was that seen or argued as a great kind of victory for women? And do you think that that's like the sort of the kind of death rattle of this, or have we still got huge amounts to do on that?
I would say that there is a kind of like an elite class of people who are very committed to the kind of the disembodied paradigm of female liberation, and that's going to die a long-winded, protracted, ugly death at some point. But it's going to be quite difficult because for a lot of people who are in positions of power, this mindset is so entrenched. It is so entrenched, and I think the light bulb moment, like the kind of the red pill moment, for so many people is what people like Mary Harrington and Louise Perry and Helen Joyce describe of the reality of motherhood. And this is why in this country, one of the greatest hubs of female radicalization, if you like, has been Mumsnet. Where you think it would be quite sort of like quite a nice, gentle, staid conversation about parenting. But actually,
sort of middle-class progressivism.
But actually, yeah, it's women realizing the truth of the embodied nature of the human person, and this having knock-on effects on their beliefs on several different hot-button political issues. And so I think reality is going to assert itself, but in the meantime, I think there is a political class where living in this kind of disembodied paradigm is something that they have kind of staked their ideological commitments on and their careers on.
Which is kind of quite unrepresentative.
I would say so, yeah.
I would say, the law that was passed decriminalising abortion, it wasn't in the manifesto. It wasn't really spoken about in any great detail. It's just kind of snuck in around the back, really. Yeah. So, I mean, we're coming towards the end of our discussion, which has been wide ranging and fascinating. And I think, I mean, one of the possible titles of the book that we didn't go for in the end, but was this quote from John Paul II that the human being is entrusted by God to women in a particular way. Christ looks to them. So what is this kind of special role that he kind of points out there?
So this is oh, sorry, I just kicked the table.
That's fine.
I got so excited about quoting Mulier Dignitatum, I'm just like breaking the furniture now. I'm so sorry. So I think this gets to the heart of what the feminine genius is. It's that receptivity and openness to receiving and protecting the human person as they are, with all their fragilities and vulnerabilities, in a way that's manifested but not confined to our physical capacity for biological motherhood. So that really gets to the heart of the feminine genius. And the bit about Christ looks to them, at the very end of the letter, JP2 says that, because the language and the symbolism of the life of the church is the language and symbolism of femininity, Virgin, Bride and Mother. He says, could we say that, he phrases it very openly, he says, could we say that Christ looks to them, as in women, for the completion, or does he say fulfillment? I think he says completion of the royal priesthood, which means, that the baptized dignity of priest, prophet and king. He just opens the question, could we say that Christ looks actually to women for this very obvious manifestation and witness of the absolute fundamentals of what we mean by the baptismal call to holiness? And he just leaves the question there. But then something he also comes back to again and again, talking about Our Lady, and actually I've only just remembered this, I forgot to say it earlier. One thing he continually says about Our Lady as the kind of the exemplar of femininity is she shows us that to serve is to reign, and that she has this great nobility, authority, dignity through putting herself at the service of the human person in God's grace. And what she reveals is that to serve in that sense is to reign, is to take on a royal dignity, which is going to the heart of what baptism is. So JP2 just puts the question out there. And actually what I say at the end of the book is that, he doesn't give us an answer to that question. Could it be said that Christ looks to woman for the fulfillment of the baptismal, the royal priesthood? And I kind of suggest that the answer is to be found in us just living our lives as Christian women. If we're going to find an answer, it's not going to be through thinking about it in the abstract, or what did JP2 mean? It's going to be through actually living that vocation we've been given. Whether we're married, single, consecrated, religious, whatever age we are, whether we work full time or we're stay-at-home mums or a mixture of both, whatever, we're going to find the answer to that question. What is Christ looking to us to achieve as his hands and feet on earth, just by living our vocation in its fullest.
And one final question, since we know that YouTube watchers tend to skew quite male as a rule, why should men read a book called The Dignity of Women in the Modern World? Because the dignity of women in the modern world is rooted in the dignity of all human persons in the modern world, and the dignity of women is found is lived out in our collaboration and our complementary relationships with men. So the dignity of men and the masculine genius lives in a collaborative and fruitful relationship with the feminine genius and the dignity of women. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Sister Carino. So where can people find your work or follow the activities of the convent there?
Well, if you want to visit us, we're down in the New Forest amongst the ponies and the donkeys. Our website is lightoftruth.uk. That's where you can find out about our work in offering formation to adult Catholics. The book's available through the Catholic Truth Society. I thought I should say that. And I write for a few other publications as well, like the Lamp magazine and the Pillar. So that's all online if you Google them and my name.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And please like and subscribe to the channel to get updates on other great videos like this. Thank you.